So the Modern Pro Tour just happened this weekend, and Michael D. Benedito won playing Tameshi Belcher. And the most interesting thing about that is that Tameshi Belcher plays 0 lands.
Right. Technically plays 20 lands.
Technically. A bit of a recurring pattern we're seeing in Magic right now with decks like Oops All Spells and now Tameshi Belcher. We thought we would talk about how the MDFC lands might be changing Magic as we know it.
Distraction makers.
It was great to see competitive Magic on the stage again. It was great to see the modern format again. It's been a year since we've had a modern Pro Tour. And the metagame seemed pretty good. Seemed pretty diverse. There were 7 different decks in the top 8. So the deck that won, Tameshi Belcher, there were 2 copies of it in the top 8. And one of them ended up taking down the tournament. Okay, so first let's kind of explain Tameshi Belcher, how it works.
What is interesting is that Goblin Char Belcher is basically a 1-card combo. You play it, pay 3 mana, tap it, and you basically reveal all the cards in your deck because it reveals until you reveal a land. But you don't reveal a land because you don't play lands.
Your opponent is just dead.
You deal damage equal to any target equal to the amount of cards revealed this way.
Yeah, effectively you're trying to count to 7, right? 3 or 4 to play the Char Belcher and 3 to activate it. And you just activate it all in one turn and beat your opponent. The deck does do some interesting things that synergize really well with each other with Tameshi. Card Lotus Bloom. If Lotus Bloom's in your graveyard, Tameshi can bring it back directly into play by returning a land from play to your hand. This also synergizes quite well with the MDFC lands, where if you return them back to your hand, you could play them as a spell if you really needed to. And I will say, this deck I think has a very high skill ceiling. Michael's is a particularly... he's a great player, just won the Pro Tour, but also seeing these really intricate lines of play that other players might not see. The fact that like your lands in play are also sort of spells in your hand in this deck. Like there's a lot going on that you have to think through. That's basically the Tameshi deck. That's what happened at the Pro Tour. But the MDFCs generally, I think, is something to analyze in terms of their impact on Magic already. And how they might continue to impact Magic in the future. MDFC lands, MDFC cards, lands, I guess lands.
Just lands.
Lands that are both a spell and a land, right? The problem that they're attempting to solve is the mana screw problem. This is the classic biggest problem that a lot of players have with Magic, is that sometimes Magic systems result in kind of just a non-game because you get mana screwed, you get mana flooded, and effectively you don't really get to play that game, and your opponent sort of gets a free win effectively. And I think it's important for us to wrap our head around why Richard Garfield at the inception of Magic decided that trade-off was worth it. I don't think that he just didn't notice or was like okay with that sort of fail state. It's contributing to part of this idea of adding noise to the data collection of playing a lot of games of Magic, and so you have to play more and more games to figure out who actually is the best and weed out sort of the when the variance is winning the game.
It also, we've done episodes on this before and talked about this, but it also creates more compelling games for people of a lower skill level. And so you're able to play with a larger amount of people because you don't have to find someone that is as close as possible to equal skill levels for you to still have a potentially good, compelling game.
Yeah, I think it also just creates more compelling games generally too. We've talked about this before, where the more often that stumbling can occur, the less optimal you can play. And so you have to sort of be good at seeing the lines of play to get to winning the game through the stumbling, effectively. If you could literally just do exactly the same thing every time, you start the game with 7 cards in your hand and they're the same 7 cards every time and you just win the game, that's not particularly interesting. That just becomes, does my best thing beat your best thing? And if it doesn't, then I'm just going to play your best thing, and that's all we're ever going to be doing at the top of the format. But that's a very simplistic view of what's going on. The MDFCs, I think, are a decent... I think on the surface, when you first look at them, you go, okay, this is a pretty good solve for making sure that players aren't they're not getting mana screwed or mana flooded as often, right? You can pick whether this is going to be a land, you can pick whether this is going to be a spell. And I think one of the reasons, like motivating factors for Wizards 2 to do this was because of Commander. I think, again, we're back to looking at how Commander is impacting the design philosophies of Magic. Because in Commander, if you get mana screwed, you're sitting there out of the game for 3 hours potentially, right? Like you were just having a non-game while your fellow Magic players are continuing to play. And that's a really bad outcome compared to what we were used to seeing in 60 card, where if you get mana screwed, the game is just over and you can just shuffle up and play another one. Where with Commander, the other 3 players are just going to keep playing until the game's over. So there's a pressure there from Wizards of the Coast to figure out how to kind of alleviate this mana screw problem so that you don't have, one person or 2 people or whatever sitting at the table with nothing to do. I think that creates a much higher, it's a much bigger problem in Commander than it would be in 1v1.
Yeah, it's hard to say if that's the root of it. I mean, I do think that the idea of creating more consistency with cards and with lands in particular, we've had more and more effects on lands and that have grown seemingly, well, not technically more powerful. We don't have Gaia's Cradles anymore, but we've got a station Gaia Cradle. So, like that seems to be something that they are leaning more and more into. And it's hard to say how much of it is because, people that are getting into the game now, there's other games don't usually have Mana Screw and Mana Flood. That was probably something closer in like 90s to early 2000s card games that were emulating the success of Magic. But since then, everyone's sort of gone the Duel Masters route for the most part. They are leaning much more into very consistent resource generation. Either every card is a resource or most cards are something or a resource. Or you just naturally get resources every single time and have kind of gone away from this tension built within the deck. So it's possible that Magic is sort of thinking that this is maybe a modern design trend that they want to move towards, and they're viewing Mana Screw or Mana Flooding as I guess a negative potentially. However, it's hard to say. Yeah, I don't know.
Another positive, I guess, another benefit, I should say, a design benefit to Mana Screw or the Magic's mana system is that the cards, like there's a tension in deck building between the cards that win you the game and the cards that pay for the things that win you the game. And so it helps make decks that are kind of all in, like this Tameshi Belcher deck or something like Red Deck Wins. There's a tension between drawing things that win you the game and things that play the things that win the game. And the reason why you want that is that it helps keep those strategies from being too consistent. And you want those all-in strategies that win the game very quickly to be more inconsistent so that decks that are playing, I guess, more fair Magic is what Magic players might call it, basically playing Magic as you would expect it, have a greater opportunity to capitalize on those stumbles. But when a deck is too consistent and it wins the game outright in the way that sort of like Tameshi Belcher does, you end up with, we need a term for this. You end up with like a really narrow focus on what the game hinges on. And it's very apparent with things like Belcher. But this is a thing that we're seeing throughout all of Magic, throughout most of Magic's Eternal formats in particular, in that the game comes down to sort of like one interaction. So if MDFC lands in that way are sort of subverting this, the system of Magic that's causing these stumbles that other decks sort of can capitalize on, and you can have this back and forth, it feels to me like Magic is sort of shifting into being a game that doesn't really revolve around that kind of play anymore. It's not a game. It doesn't feel like a game anymore where there are a lot of sub games that are adding up to one person winning. Like if you win a critical mass of sub games of interactions with your opponent that you end up winning the game, it turns into there's one sub game which is the whole game.
Right.
And that's, I played Belcher. Can you stop it?
So, and I guess we can, I think maybe it's to try and make the argument as to why MDFC lands are maybe the culprit or something to be concerned about that might lead more towards play patterns like that, right?
Right.
Because it's like what you're talking about
them, potentially.
is how many, it's not that this isn't common in combo decks, but like we talked about, is that combo decks usually have more than one card, right? Meaning that you at the very least have 2 points of interaction to stop someone before they end up winning. It's not to say that NDFCs are necessarily the cause of that, right? Those are the things that initiate the combos. But what MDFC lands are allowing things to happen is that, like you said, it's removing that tension. And so the possibility is that you are making those combo lines more consistent over time, right? As opposed to the usual tension is something closer to something, I guess, like combo or rush, right? Or something that might have to last into the late game versus like an early game rush deck. And rush has this tension of running out of lands, so you play as little of lands as possible that you can manage, so you can play as many lightning bolts as possible, right? And combo instead usually has this sort of tension of, okay, can you generate enough resources? Can you have enough things to sort of prolong the game until you get your combo going? But if your resources now offer you opportunities to also prevent that person from winning, now that is making your thing much more powerful. It'd be the equivalent essentially if there was an MDFC land that basically is a lightning bolt, which I should probably check to see if that exists already.
I don't think that exists yet. Right. I think it will. I think it will, or at least a shock, right? Any kind of a burn spell land would be particularly strong. Yeah. I think what's interesting about this too, right? I was comparing this I guess problem. I was comparing this to Companion, right? In that when we did our analysis on Companion, I think part of the reason why that mechanic was so broken is because if you weren't playing a Companion, you almost weren't even playing the same game as your opponent. You started the game with one extra card in hand than your opponent did. Where these MDFCs, I think, are a bit more subtle, but they're having a very similar impact on the game, right? Because if you can come up with a strategy that effectively plays no lands, you are at such a higher level of consistency than what your opponent is, because that whatever that MDFC land that you drew, it's either a land or it's not in the moment that you draw it, or in the moment that you blast through your whole deck and look for a land that's there to stop you or whatever in Oops All Spells or Tameshi. I think it's tough to analyze this because these combo decks that do this are using the fact that they're playing no lands to the most extreme effect, when I think the impact of these is going to be it could be theoretically more subtle as decks become more consistent because they're effectively playing less lands. And if you're not doing that, then you are not playing the same Magic game as your opponent is, in a similar way to the fact that if your opponent is playing a Companion and you're not, they're starting the game with one more card in hand than you. And that is, that's something that impacted the game all the way down to Vintage. The MDFC lands, I think, have a similar, like the potential to make a similar impact on Magic.
There is one burn spell modal land. It is Spikefield Cave. Enters tapped, so it's already probably not going to be played.
Yeah, that's probably why.
It gives a red mana, or it can be Spikefield Hazard, which is one red instant spell that deals 1 damage to any target, and if a permanent dealt damage this way would die, it is exiled instead. So it's technically a spell that could be used that way, but just not strong enough. Right.
Yeah.
Whereas something like Sink into Stupor is just a good bounce spell. Right, that also acts as a land.
Yeah, I do think that right now particular strategies are more okay playing this kind of stuff. Like Tameshi Belcher is kind of a turn 4 kind of deck, where some amount of lands coming into play tapped is not the end of the world for them. But a red deck wins hyper effective deck is really, you can't play any lands that come into play tapped. You're trying to beat your opponent as efficiently and quickly as possible. So I do think in the future it's very possible that we get some kind of a land that works in a red deck wins kind of deck, though.
Well, and I think what's going to push that probably is these eternal formats, right? Is that we talked, I think before starting, that like this isn't going to affect Standard, really, because Standard will rotate out, right? It's going to affect these eternal formats like Modern and like Legacy and Commander. And I think right now, Modern is kind of the main one to look at, because Modern is the second most played format out of all formats officially. And so if that's the case, then that's something that they should really, the designers really need to look at. Players are really interested in what's going on with the meta and the type of cards that you get to use in it. And so if the power level of those decks starts to go in a certain direction, we might see in Modern Horizons 4 or whatever, more of these modal lands, and something that might end up sort of bumping up the overall like rush red deck win strategies to account for something like that. I think that if we take this to its most extreme, what's going to happen is that the less and less that the resources cause tension with your game plan, and you see higher levels of consistency. Consistency in Rush is probably, I think, the biggest issue out of all. because consistency in combo lines is a problem, but really it's the length of time to get that combo line, right? And so if the length of time to get a Tameshi Belcher up by turn 4, if it's just inevitable by turn 4, that's fine. But if it's also inevitable in very high consistency for a rush deck to win by turn 3, then it doesn't really matter if the combo deck is also consistent and can win by that time.
Right.
Or, a turn later.
I mean, okay, so let's move into sort of like talking about Magic's future with MDFCs and what like maybe the extremes of that could be, but also I think the incremental creeping towards those extremes where this is just design space is part of it, right? It's also a way to kind of power creep the game, right? If you can print an MDFC card that immediately goes into something like Red Deck Wins, but if other archetypes had already been subverted by the MDFCs like Tameshi Belcher, and suddenly Red Deck Wins needs an MDFC to compete, to be consistent enough to even like compete with what else is going on, I think that's like stepping into this ratcheting feedback loop where once every deck is playing these MDFC cards, it starts to compound until eventually we get to the point where lands just aren't really a factor in Magic anymore, and Magic starts to look more like Duel Masters or Lorcana or whatever. It's not the end of the world, right? It's like that's still a functional card game. It's just one that doesn't have Magic's mana system anymore, effectively.
Right. It's not to say that there isn't still going to be strategy and how you play around what your opponent's going to do. Sideboarding and stuff like that is obviously also going to be a nice little sub-game that still exists. Like, these things are still going to exist and be a thing, but I do think that more consistency in decks, I think, makes for a more definitive meta when it comes to the decks that get made. I don't know if that's totally the case. I'm not as familiar with like games like Lorcana or like Duel Masters and what their metas have looked like. Yeah. I feel like there's usually some tension with decks that like is less consistent, but maybe can win faster versus something that is more consistent, but wins later, right? And that's a good sort of polarized tension that can exist in a meta. But the closer that consistency comes together, the more you're probably going to reach something either that's all rush or leaning towards something like mid-range.
Right. The fewer instances of randomness you have, the more individual point of randomness matters. So if, let's say you're playing baseball and all players are exact clones, right? And they're all playing a game of baseball together, and they're all as equally skilled, perfect specimens, then the coin flip is the thing that decides the game, right? And that's because that's the sort of one piece of random. And also they're playing in a space where physics doesn't exist. And so, whatever. Baseball is maybe not the best example because there's physical, actual like physical randomness at work. So in that way, like that Magic's not subject to that variance, right? It can't, like if it's raining outside, it doesn't affect your game of Magic. So Magic and I guess games versus sports or sort of like games that are testing almost purely physical or almost purely mental skill, I think are more subject to this problem where the less randomness in the game, the more the individual piece of like point of randomness matters.
Right, which is just the cards that you draw, right?
Or whether or not you're going first or second.
Sure.
I think we're even starting to see this pressure happen more and more on Magic. It was interesting. The commentators during the Pro Tour kept saying like, the coin flip is going to matter a lot in this one. And I'm just like, oof, like that doesn't feel great that like the fact that you're going first is going to matter so much because the format has been it's so consistent and it's so focused on like an individual interaction being the deciding point of the game that again, it's that like the less randomness, the more randomness determines the game. Yeah. Which, we got that chart from Richard Garfield that's basically saying the more randomness, the less returns to skill that you get. But I think there's another chart here that needs to be
right. It's the inverse in a way.
Yeah, it's like the less randomness, the more randomness decides the game. The more impact each individual piece of randomness has.
Right. Higher level of equal skill means that any opportunities for variance, has a higher return basically. And I think that naturally, especially in a competitive format, you're going to be hearing lots of feedback from players about consistency. And about wanting to do the thing, not having mana screw, mana flood, not having bad mulligan rules. Like, this is something that has been going on forever with card games, and I think that there's like a lot of different design philosophies that people have with this, right? You hear a game like Flesh and Blood that sort of advocates for they say least amount of randomness possible, but even that has like randomness, but that's not necessarily like great, right? Because like exactly what we're talking about here, where it's suddenly, now that you have less of that randomness, now those points of randomness are a much bigger deal.
They're magnified, effectively, yeah.
And so it can actually potentially have the inverse effect and have you feel like even more so that the randomness, that you were subject to the randomness. Yeah. And I think like I'm not as familiar with the Yu-Gi-Oh meta, so don't get upset with me about this, but I've heard,
they will.
Yeah. I've heard many people refer to modern Yu-Gi-Oh as sort of a coin flip simulator, right? And it doesn't help that, if there's, let's say, 10 plus decks that are all viable in a meta and each one has approximately the same win percentage, that's looking like a coin flip simulator. That's not a realistic meta. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, and that's interesting too, right? Because like you can create a lot of decks that have this exact play pattern, right? Where they hinge on one particular interaction. And if that interaction succeeds, then one player wins. If that interaction fails, then the game continues, I guess. And then the other player does the same thing. And that starts to come like that. Then it's not necessarily the coin flip, but it might be the coin flip because that might be the first person that gets to attempt to win. But it might also come down to the point of randomness of whether or not like which person drew more counter spells. And that's kind of the dynamic we start seeing emerge in something like CEDH or even this Tameshi Belcher deck, especially in the Tameshi Belcher mirror. I don't know. To me, it's not a particularly good sign for the health of the game in terms of like how many coin flips, how many individual instances of randomness mattered in these games. And I think the MDFCs are attributing to minimizing that amount of randomness that's happening in each game, right?
Yeah.
Because you can choose whether it's a land or a spell.
If you enjoyed listening to us talk about MDFC lands and you want to guess what MDFC stands for, because we always forget, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment on what MDFC stands for down below.
Also, if you want to join our Discord, I don't have an MDFC joke. You can click the link in the description. It's there, I promise. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.